Hey everyone, it's Anthony from Pretty Printed here. In this video, I'll be continuing where I left off in the last video on Flask Dance. And in this one, I'll be talking about how to integrate Flask Login and Flask SQL Alchemy with Flask Dance. So you can have someone potentially log in using Flask Dance instead of using a regular username and password. So to get started with this, the very first thing I need to do is I need to create a database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a database file. So I'll just create this. I'll call this login.db. It can be anything. And then I'll set it up here in my app. So I'll need to configure the database URI. So I'll go ahead and do that. So SQL Alchemy database URI. And the path, I believe, is this. So login.db. Okay, so now that I have that, I can import SQL Alchemy. So from Flask _ SQL Alchemy, import SQL Alchemy. And there are a couple of other things that I want to import as well. There are a couple of mixins that I want. So because I'm using Flask Login, I'm going to import the user mixin from Flask Login. So user mixin, and I'll get back to the other things that I have to import later. And then I'll also import a mixin from Flask Dance. So this one's going to be flaskdance.consumer.backend.sqla. I'm going to import the OAuth consumer mixin. So what this OAuth consumer mixin is going to do is it's going to add properties to a class that I'm going to create in just a moment. And the same for user mixin. So the first thing I need to do is I need to instantiate the database. So DB is SQL Alchemy, and then I'll pass in the app. And then after that, I can go ahead and actually create the tables. So there are two tables that I want. The first table is typical of a login system. You want a user table. So I'm going to use the user mixin that I imported from Flask Login. Along with that, I'm going to use db.model because I need that to actually use Flask SQL Alchemy. I'm going to create a couple of columns. The first column will be an integer column, and the primary key is going to be true. And then I'll have a username column. So db column, db string, and let's say 250, and then the username will be unique. All right, so for this, you could have other columns for the users like an email address, a location, full name, whatever. But since this is just an example of using Flask Login, I'm not going to get into all that. And then I'll create a second class, and I'll call the class OAuth, but the actual table name is going to be different in the database because of this OAuth consumer mixin that I'm using. So I'll demonstrate that in a moment. But I'll also include DB model. And for this one, I'm going to have a couple of columns. I'm going to have a user ID column, which is going to be foreign keyed to the ID column in the user table. So it's going to be an integer, and I'm going to use db.foreignkey and pass in user ID. And also, I'm going to create a relationship between the two tables with Flask SQL Alchemy, and I'll just pass in the user class there. All right, so with those two classes done, I can actually create the table. So let me make sure I have the DB. I do. So I'll start up Python, and I'll say from app import DB, and then DB creates all. Okay, so I'm going to open the file in Jade. I haven't used Jade in a while. So let's find the database login. And I see on the left-hand side, I have two tables here. I have a user table, has ID and username. And then I have this other table, Flask _ dance _ OAuth. And it has an ID column, a provider column, a created at column, a token column, and a user ID column. And if you notice the class that I created, it only has the user ID here, but in the actual table, it has 4 additional columns. And that is because of that OAuth consumer mixin. It's adding the extra attributes to the class so those columns get created. So there's an ID column, a provider column, created at, and token. And all those are going to be used by Flask Dance automatically. So now the next thing I need to do is I need to kind of create a relationship between Flask Dance, and Flask SQL Alchemy. And to do that, I'm going to specify the backend on the blueprint. So the first thing I need to do is I need to import the SQL Alchemy backend from Flask Dance Consumer.backend.SQLA. So I'll add that. So SQL Alchemy backend. And now that I have that, I can actually create the connection between the two. So for this video, I'm only going to demonstrate the Twitter login, but for the GitHub login, it's pretty much the same. Just like I showed you in the last video, how the two are pretty much the same. This will be the same for both, but I don't want to spend too much time in the video covering both cases when they're pretty much the same. The only thing different is the name. So what I'll do is I'll create the backend here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the Twitter blueprint. So Twitter_blueprint. And I'm going to add a backend. And this backend is going to be the SQL Alchemy backend that I have here. So first, let me move this below the OAuth table. It comes logically after. And I need to pass in three things. I'm going to pass in the OAuth table that I created, the class. So that's the first argument, so OAuth. The second argument is going to be the database session. So it's basically db.session. And then I need to pass in something that represents a user who is logged in. So user is going to be equal to current user. And that current user is going to come from Flask login current user. So I'll go ahead and import that. So what this is doing, the SQL Alchemy backend, is basically connecting the OAuth token that gets passed whenever someone authorizes the app to the current user who's in the Flask login. So with these two things, the SQL Alchemy backend will actually connect the two for you. So you don't have to explicitly say that user ID 1 has this OAuth authorization token. It will take care of all that for you. So that's kind of the magic part. You'll see how that works in just a moment. So now what I need to do is I need to add the other things for Flask login just to get that working. So let me import those. I'm going to import login manager so I can instantiate it. I have the user mixin. I also want the login required decorator. I want login user, and then I'll use logout user as well. All right, so that should be everything I need from Flask login. So what I'll do is I'll instantiate Flask login. So I'll put it right here. Login manager. It's login manager, and I'll pass in the app. And in addition to that, I need to create the user loader. So I'll create that. Let's put it right here between the backend and the class. So login_manager, user loader. And by the way, if you're not familiar with Flask login, just check out my Flask login videos and then come back to this one because everything else will make sense once you have an understanding of Flask login. So what this is doing, this is going to return the user ID that is in the session, or the user that belongs to the ID that's in the session. So this is just an internal thing used by Flask login. So convert the user ID to an integer. Okay. So now that I have all that, I have the foundation of my login system down. So one other thing that I want to do is I want to create a couple of routes that represent protected pages and a logout page. So the first one will be a protected page, and I'll just use the index. Doesn't need to be the index, but since this is my callback URL, this is probably the most straightforward one. So I'll put a login required on the index. And what I'll do is I'll simply return the username. So I'll say you are logged in as blank. And then I'll format that with the current user.username. And then I'll create a logout route, app routes, logouts. And then it's going to take the login required decorator. And I'll call this logout. It's going to log out the user. So logout user. And then I'll return the user to the index. So return redirect URL for index. And when you log out and you return to the index, it should tell you you are unauthorized. All right, so that's the foundation of the login system. As you've probably noticed, I haven't actually done anything to log in a user yet. I just set up some things around it. So that's what I'm going to do now. But let me just make sure that my app works before I move on. So I'll start up the app, and then I'll go to the index, and it tells me unauthorized. So that's exactly what I want. I want it to be unauthorized because I haven't actually logged in yet. So now what I want to do is I want to modify this Twitter route a little bit. And like I said, the GitHub example will be analogous, but for now, just the Twitter route. And what I want to do is, instead of simply going to this page to log in, I'm going to use more of the Flask Dance functionality to take care of the login, and I'll put the login user there. So to do this, what I'm going to use is something called OAuth authorize. And what this is a signal in Flask. So anytime that you authorize an app using Flask Dance, a signal gets activated, and this OAuth authorize will pick up that signal and do something. So I need to import OAuth authorize from Flask Dance.consumer. So import OAuth underscore authorized, I believe. And then what I'll do is I'm going to add this signal. So I'll put it here under the Twitter route. So OAuth authorized. So that's what I just imported. I'm going to add connect via, and then I need to pass in the blueprint that I'm listening to for an authorization token. And that blueprint is the Twitter blueprint. So what happens here is anytime someone authorizes the app, I will then have this signal called, and whatever function is underneath this decorator will be processed after the signal. So this isn't a typical route. Instead, it's just a signal. So it doesn't return a view or anything, but you can still do things inside of it. So I'll call this Twitter logged in. And it's going to take in two parameters or two arguments. First will be the blueprint, and the second will be the token. And those should be self-explanatory. The blueprint is going to be the actual Twitter blueprint, and the token is going to be the authorization token. So now what I want to do is basically I'm going to move some of the information from the Twitter login down to the signal for Twitter logged in. So the first thing I want to do is I want to move the account info down. So what I'll do is I'll pass the account or add the account info there, but I can't use Twitter directly here. Instead, I'll just use the blueprint. So I'll use blueprint and then .session, and it's pretty much the same as this Twitter session. So it's kind of generic. And then after that, I'm going to do the same check. So if the account info is okay, meaning that the authorization went through and there are no errors. I'm not handling the case where it doesn't work, but if everything went through and everything is fine, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the account info, and then from there I can get the username. So the username is going to be the screen name. So let me just copy that and add it there. Okay, so that's pretty much the same as what I did in this part. So since I won't be using this in the same way, I'll modify it a little bit so I don't have to worry about trying to log in. So if Twitter is not authorized, I'm still going to do the same thing. So this will act as like a login link. And then I'll have the account info. And basically I'll say, I don't need to check OK. So I'll just put the account info JSON here, and I'll return the screen name for them if they're logged in. So I'll save that. So this route will just display my username if I'm logged in. And if I'm not logged in, it will redirect me to the login page so I can actually authorize the app. So in this section here, this is where I actually want to log in the user. So what I'm saying here is that if the account info is okay, what I want to do is I want to get the username from the account. And now that I have the username, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check the database to see if that user exists. If the user exists in the database, then I will simply log in that user. If that user does not exist in the database, then I'll create a new user and then log in that user. So first thing I want to do is I want to add one exception from SQL Alchemy just to make things easier. So from SQLAlchemy.orm.exe, which is short for exception, I'm going to import no results found. And then I will go back to the signal. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to query the database for the users. So I'll say query user query filter by username equals username. So it's going to look for this username in the database, but I'm not going to add a one or an all or a first here yet. Instead, I'll use that exception that I just created. So I'll try this. So user is going to be query.one. So what this is going to do is it's going to execute this query that I have up here. If this query executes successfully, meaning that there is a user in the database with that username, then that user will get assigned to the user variable there. If there isn't, then it's going to raise an exception called no result found, which is I just imported. And if I get no result found, that means that that user does not exist in the database and I need to create a user. So user is going to be equal to user and then username. All right, because the class user only has username. And you'll notice that I'm not actually doing anything to the OAuth class because this backend here, the SQL Alchemy backend, is going to take care of that for me automatically. So now that I have the user, I can just say db session add user and then db session commits. And now I have a user that is either an existing user here or a new user. And all I have to do is log in the user. And that's it. So because this is a signal, it happens kind of in the background. So I don't need to return anything. I don't have to redirect anywhere. I could flash something if I wanted to, but in this case, I'll just leave it simple like that. So this should be enough to actually try out the login functionality. So let's see if it works. My app is still running successfully. So I'm still unauthorized, but when I go to Twitter, so /Twitter, that is going to act as kind of the login link for Twitter. You could use Twitter login directly for the blueprint, but instead I'm simply going to go to /Twitter. So let's see if that works. So /Twitter. And it redirects me to Twitter to log in. So it's telling me, should I authorize my app? And I do. So I'll log in. So pretty_print it. I'll put in my password. And then when I hit authorize app, I'm expecting that it will redirect me to the index page. And remember, the index is the callback URL, and it just tells me who I'm logged in as. So it has the current user.username. So I know if this is working if I don't get any errors, because current user only works if I am logged in as a user. And remember, this Twitter logged in signal is called right after you authorize an app. So because my user is not in the database, it's not going to find one. It's going to create a new one, and then it's going to log in that user. So let's see. Authorize app. Don't save. And now it redirects me to the index, and it tells me I am logged in as pretty_printed. So let's take a look at my database. And if I go to user, I see a user ID of 1 and the username of pretty_printed. So that's what I did directly in the code here by creating this user and adding it to the session and committing it. But if I look at the Flask Dance OAuth table, I see some information here. So I see an ID, I see a provider, I see a created at, I see a token, and I see the user ID. So the user ID is foreign key to the user table, and then the rest of this information was created automatically by Flask Dance. So it has some information about my token. It tells me when it was created, tells me who the provider was, and it creates an ID for it automatically. And because I have these two, it kind of creates the login connection for me automatically. So if I go back to Twitter, the link, it simply gives me the result because I am now logged in and authorized. So as long as I'm logged in, I get that page, and if I go to the index, I'm logged in as pretty_printed. So now at this point, you can use Flask login in the typical way. You can create more routes that have login required, and you can then log out the user, and those routes would no longer be accessible. So if I go to /logout, I get unauthorized again, because remember, I'm just simply redirecting to the index. And now that I'm logged out, the authorization should no longer be valid. So if I go to Twitter again, I should have to reauthorize my app. And that's exactly what I have to do. So I'm logged into Twitter, so I don't have to log in again, but it is asking me to authorize the app again. So if I hit authorize, then it redirects me to the index page with my username, meaning that I am logged in again. So that turns out to be pretty straightforward. And like I said, if you want to use GitHub, it's pretty much analogous, but I don't want to spend too much time working on that because it's pretty much the same thing. And any other provider that you want to use, so Facebook or Google or any of the other ones, it's pretty much the same process that you can go through to get this. And if you have an understanding of Flask login, then you should be able to take this and apply it to your application because it's pretty much the same thing after this point. Really, the only unique part was logging in a user who authorized an app using OAuth. So that's all I want to cover for this video. If you have any questions about this video, you can leave a comment down below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please subscribe. So I'll put a link in the description below for the code so you can download this code. Also, I'll put a link in the description below for my website, prettyprinted.com, so you can check out Flask courses that are more in-depth than my YouTube tutorials. And that's pretty much it. So thank you for watching this video, and I will talk to you next time.